Hey everyone. So, I want to start a series about, let's say, the ways that we could organize society in a libertarian anarchist sort of sense. It's easy to take a look at the state and point out its inconsistencies, its inefficiencies, the ways that it's immoral, and all those sorts of things. But I think one of the more interesting things, and maybe one of the more positive ways of going about trying to organize society, is talk about the possibilities and not necessarily just be a downer attacking what exists. And so the first subject I'd like to talk about is privatizing the police. To start off, this is my vision for perhaps restoring the role of law enforcement to a prestigious, noble career profession, and try to get rid of some of the issues that we are running into now with police. Obviously, in society at large, there's a lot of groups butting heads over, are the police good, are the police bad? And they're both wrong. The police are just, law enforcement is just set up along improper, or let's say inefficient, what's the word? It's systematic. The problems are bad. The system's bad. The incentives, the incentives are bad. And I think that's why a lot of the outcomes we're seeing are not desirable. Whether it's the over persecution or over arresting, over policing of minority groups, the high incarceration rates, the tendency for police to do unreasonable searches, whether that's physically or digitally. And all those sorts of things. Police have migrated from the, let's say, their rhetoric of protect and serve. Now it's something a little bit different. And it's not necessarily their fault. It's incentives, it's politics, it's government. But so let's start fleshing out maybe what it might look like, what incentives, what systemic rules should we base policing on, and shave off some of the harsher outcomes that we're experiencing right now. So, being a libertarian, obviously the first thing I would like to point out is that taxation is theft. And I'm sure there are other videos here where you can see me talk about that, or probably most other libertarians have covered the topic. But in short, it's theft because it's taken from individuals by force. There's no choice. And that money is used on whatever programs that politicians or bureaucrats want, just at large. And there's no real way for people to remove their consent, especially if there are programs that, a lot of us can agree are immoral. But for whatever reasons, there's not enough organization between all the people that feel that way to overcome political and bureaucratic barriers to changing said policy. And so that's part of the problem with policing, right? Is they, no matter what they do, they will get their money. There's no, it's a very one-sided relationship, right? You pay your taxes, and then they give you the goods and the service that they want to give you, good and hard. Well, if they had to convince you to pay for policing, convince you to pay them, well, then they would need to be responsive to the needs, wants, and desires of the people paying into whatever police department is in that area. And if they start doing bad things, or they do enough bad things to where people no longer want to give them money, their profits go down, they can't pay their people, they got to fix it real quick. And I think that's the difference between the free market and these kind of socialized services that people like to say are public goods that can't really be provided by the free market. But let's I'm going to explore perhaps why that's not the case. So let's imagine that there's enough people, we're on board, local police departments are sold off, privatized, dismantled, however you want to think about it. So I think the first hurdle we need to talk about is, would there be police departments? Would there be law enforcement or security firms that would take their place? And I would say yes, for a couple of reasons. One, the people that make up these organizations, the police officers, the detectives, the administrative people, the experts, they still exist. And these people, for whatever reason, whether it's their innate character and temperament from whatever biological sources there are, or whatever experiences they've had in life that led them into that career, they still exist. And I imagine that they would still want to provide a noble service like protecting people from crime and harm. So they exist, right? And on the other side, I don't know about everybody else, but I do want a police department to exist, or law enforcement, or security, whatever name you want to put on it. I would like to purchase their services because I, for one, I'm fully willing to admit that I don't want to be the one holding, the firearm and chasing down someone who was a threat to other people. I do it, it's necessary, but it's not something I would want to do every day. And so I'd rather do this, or what I do for a living. And so I'll happily outsource that. And I think most other people will too. I mean, it'll be like hiring somebody to do, clean your house, or to do your laundry, or, I think it would be on the scale of just like another utility you paid for. It'd be your Netflix subscription. But I feel it would be much cheaper at the end of it compared to what taxes we pay. So we could say that there's going to be a supply of security services. I'll just say security services. I'm not sure about law enforcement, but I suppose that's an appropriate term. And we'd have a demand with good and righteous people wanting to protect their families by outsourcing it and hiring someone else to do it. Now, why? Now, as far as it goes to like the public good sort of thing, is a lot of people get tripped up on imagining that security or law enforcement would not be distributed very evenly. And perhaps the most common thing people would gravitate towards thinking is that only the rich would have these security forces or this law enforcement. And so the poor wouldn't have it, the rich would have it, and there's some externalities that are borne out by that would put poor people at a greater disadvantage, in addition to just not having a police force or law enforcement that works for them. I don't think this would be the case because if you look everywhere else in the market for goods and services, regardless of what good it is or what service it is, there are tiers of service that get created, whether it's within the same company or it's within spread out amongst a bunch of different companies. There are watches that you can buy for, $5 that will tell the time poorly for a short amount of time. Well, it'll do the job. And then there are watches that are, cost as much as a vehicle. You can look at cell phones. There are cell phones that run the gambit from being very cheap to being very expensive. Cars, computers, everything is tiered out, and most people, as long as you work a job full time and you're relatively responsible, you can get all the goods and services you need at whatever tier is affordable. Obviously, you're not going to be able to get the greatest and the best, but it's a reflection of how economically valuable you are. And I don't know about you, but doling out goods and services compared to how much value you bring into society is pretty fair. It's a pretty good hierarchy to create. I'm off on a tangent. But so there are tiers in everything else, all goods and services in the economy. So there will be companies that cater to all socioeconomic statuses. There could be even drawn along racial lines. I mean, communities do tend to group under similarities, whether that's income, hobbies, race, beliefs. From, we could say, the frivolous to the substantial. People will organize themselves into groups. And in these groups are people that will have resources to spend, and they're going to want security and protection, and then they can outsource that to a company that wants to provide that to them. The next step, perhaps, is describing how these security companies would interact with each other. So right now, everyone is there's already overlapping in a diverse set of law enforcement agencies. You have county, you have city, state, federal, and the federal has, a dozen law enforcement agencies, or at least agencies with, armed agents that are tasked with enforcing laws or whatnot. So there's no shortage of law enforcement organizations right now. And it is true that they all work for the same organization, give or take. As far as I understand it, there's bickering between, let's say, state level law enforcement and the feds, and even from understanding, different federal law enforcement agencies have beef with each other, and they get tribal in their own way because they're made up of people, and people tend to be tribal. But so they're kind of made to organize because they're forced to. They're part of the same organization. But let's say that there are a bunch of security companies or law enforcement companies in a given area. Why would they be incentivized to work together? Why wouldn't one of them just become, get the most customers, become the largest, get the most guns, and then just take over from everybody else? We'll cover that scenario first. And so that scenario is I wouldn't worry about that one. That's trouble. That's problematic. I don't like that word. I don't think that's a very realistic idea, because I don't know about you, but if I was paying into an organization that looked like it was teetering towards some sort of tyranny and some sort of violence and coercion, I would stop giving them money, and I'd start giving my money to a different company. But let's say somehow people weren't paying attention, or it happened very quickly, or they did it underhandedly or in secret, but the company gets huge, gets all the guns, gets a ton of people, and now it's going to try to exert itself as some sort of government. Well, violence and this sort of, I guess you could maybe call it war, that it would have to engage in to keep its power once people found out that they don't like what this company is doing, is very expensive. It's very, very, very expensive. And in the long run, how do you control a population of people where there is no real gun control? There might be some limiters on, like people getting nukes or 50 cals. One, because they're hella expensive. They're really expensive. And maybe companies wouldn't just want to, sell 50 cals to, Joe Bob down the street. But there'd be an armed populace. And using all your men and resources just to violently extract money from people, and at every step of the way being resisted by armed individuals, armed resistance groups, and other companies that would pop up and say, hey, we're the good guys. Throw your weight behind us, we'll protect you, and we'll fight this corrupt business that's trying to act like a government. And that's not sustainable long term, because even with the full power and might of the U.S. military, we've had little to no success in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and some of these other countries where we obviously have the overwhelming firepower, we have the manpower, we have the equipment, the explosives, we have everything. But these tenacious mountain men with weapons that we gave them in the 80s, they've had a really good fight with us, and they've tired us out and shown the futility of trying to tamp down a population that doesn't want to be, and that's well armed, and that values their freedom, which is a society that I would like to see emulated here. The desire for freedom, and like a philosophical freedom, not like this, obviously backwards, third world, unsophisticated, unenlightened sort of population, but like a genuine libertarian, non-aggression principle sort of basis, which doesn't mean you can't defend yourself. Non-aggression allows for defense. Aggression is making the first step or the first act against someone else who doesn't deserve it. Let's put it that way. So I believe that the tyrannical security or law enforcement organization is kind of just an irrational fear, or maybe not irrational, but I don't think it plays out economically, and I don't think it would play out very realistically in the type of a society that values the types of things that I think it should. Let's see. Okay, so you have all these small ones, and they're not going to grow huge because they don't want to fight with each other, and they don't want to have to fight with an armed population. So I think that would keep them from being, tyrannical and trying to control the local population. But obviously there would be friction between these different organizations. Like I said before, conflict is a very expensive thing. And conflict it doesn't produce much, economically speaking. And if under the profit motive, over the long term, you want to make money. And the way you make money is by cooperating and producing value for other people. And so while there might be some crosstalk or some competing interests between these companies, neither of them would have legislative, they wouldn't have regulatory capture. They wouldn't have politicians to petition to give them special rights, to give them monopoly power, to give them, tax breaks or any other special, permission or privilege that other companies wouldn't have. And so when they're competing together, over the long term, it is much more valuable and economical, and you can get a lot more money by working together with other companies. Now there's some, to keep this from getting this video becoming too long, obviously that plays into also bodies that would make law, so like private courts, which will be a future video that I make at some point. But without getting into the law, so these police organizations will work with each other and they'll have to figure it out. So let's say there's a situation where there's one person who has a security or a law enforcement company. They subscribe to law enforcement company A, and there's law enforcement company B. What would stop law enforcement company B from going over and arresting someone who is under law enforcement company A? Now, this would all come down, I think, to the terms of services offered by each company. So let's say it's something like drug use. Someone subscribes to a company that says drug use is permissible, it's fine, just don't hurt anybody else. And law enforcement company B operates under law or rules saying, hey, drug use is illegitimate and it's worthy of taking your money or throwing you in jail. Obviously, if B comes over and tries to arrest the other person, A is going to come back and say, hey, you don't have a legitimate reason to come over here. But so with this first initial preventing of going to arrest somebody, why else would law enforcement company B still persist even if it leads to violence? I don't think they would, because one, they're not getting money from that person. And there's no extra money to be had from it. And so why expend men, resources, all these things that could be lost in a conflict to get somebody that hasn't hurt somebody underneath, your set of rules or your agreement with your customers? It'd be pretty silly to reach out and just expend all this money for no real benefit. Now, you could police that with company B, could police that policy within people that voluntarily sign up for it. Like, let's say you live in a neighborhood and somehow most or all of you believe drug use is bad and you just don't want it in your neighborhood. And so you bring in a company, you're like, hey, we want you to protect us and we don't want drugs in the neighborhood. You sign it up with them, you give them money, and they provide, the service in your area. And if somebody who's in that area that uses drugs while having signed that agreement, they get snatched up and, punished in whatever way is described underneath the contract, because they agreed to it, they breached the contract, they agreed to the punishment. Now, why would they reach outside of their pool of customers to try to imprison someone else that just has an organization that's going to push back and make it more costly for them? It'd be pretty irrational. So that's kind of a gray area, right? Where there's some people who believe that drug use is bad and should be outlawed, and some people think that it should be permissible. And this, I think, comes to one of the other things that would be more evenly applied and more evenly enforced, and where organizations would be quick to cooperate with each other. And that's your basic, assault, murder, rape, theft, breaking and entering. All that stuff is pretty universally looked down upon, right? I don't think there's any cultures, at least within the U.S., that have significant differences in how things like that should be handled. So why wouldn't these companies cooperate to enforce these basic rules across their lines? Obviously, I think they would focus on the people that purchase their service, but it's the whole I'll rub your back, you rub mine, and we can all get together. So over the long term, I think there's all the incentives for these security agencies, these law enforcement agencies, to cooperate with each other. One, because obviously it's cheaper, you can make more money, and nobody has to get hurt. They're incentivized to enforce a baseline set of rules that most everybody agrees to, and all the little differences that they might have. There's a lot of disincentives to reaching out and punishing someone for a peaceful act that if they don't belong to a security organization that prohibits that sort of action. Because of the profit motive, these companies would be highly incentivized to be reactive to the needs, wants, desires of their customer base. I'm not saying that this would be perfect. It would absolutely not be. And the reason for that is because humans are involved, right? The law enforcement apparatus that we have now is not perfect. And I've laid out the reasons why that is. But I think it's worth approaching a methodology of trying to fix complex societal issues through voluntary agreements and interactions. I've said it before and I'll say it again, and it's a bit repetitive. I probably say it every time, but introducing coercion and violence and whatever else into a situation imbalances the power towards the people who are allowed to initiate force. And over time, they're going to creep past the original agreement, and they're going to trample, the rights and liberties of the people that they're supposed to protect. The war on drugs is a big one. All the violations of the Fourth Amendment, the spying on all of our digital lives is pretty ubiquitous. And they could do this because there's absolutely no way for us to give them a strong signal to stop doing it. I mean, we could all organize and try to tell them to stop doing it, but one, they could just push it underground and just make it all confidential and not talk about it. And two, there's even a split between the population. And we're in a case where if there's enough people who vote who believe in one way, they can maintain a system that is unjust on the rest of us just because they're politically active enough and they're organized enough, which, I don't know, for me, that's no way to run a society and to create laws and to uphold morality. We really, really need to make government feel the pain for their poor choices. Because right now, let's say I'm going to go on another tangent. The police on every level get a lot of money for the war on drugs. And I think most of us now can agree that the war on drugs is highly immoral. And it's a violation of human rights, even though I don't like, let's not say human rights, let's say property rights. It's a violation of property rights to prevent someone from taking a drug into their own body and not harming someone else. But it doesn't matter. They're going to get their money, and the more drugs that they pull off of the streets, the more money they get. And they're going to prioritize the drug war, which they do, over all other crime, over serious, violent crime where people are actually hurt. Now, are there drug dealers that are violent? Oh, absolutely. But I think that's largely a function of they're being chased by men with guns, so they need to have guns to protect themselves. And then with a highly charged situation like that, it's fringe people who are willing to be violent, who are willing to be, that risk, willing to accept that level of risk, get into it, and it just gets more dangerous and more dangerous. And it's an escalation of force sort of thing on both sides. So what do we do? What should we do about the police? We should privatize them. It won't be clean at first. There's a lot to be figured out. And I'm not saying that that's the only way. And I'm not arguing necessarily for an outcome. I'm arguing for a methodology. And the methodology is make agreements with each other and try to find cooperative ways to, in this instance, to protect people and property, to enforce contracts. Yeah, that's about it. When it comes down to it, that's about it. All right, thanks for listening. See ya.